y volver a pensar. ¿Ya se cuenta más de Arturo? Yo había oído que sí iba a ir. Ya queda dejarlo, ¿no? Ah, claro. Muchas gracias por invitarme. Mucho más.
Hey everybody. Hello. We're about to get started, please. Hi, welcome everybody to Convergencias 2011, a critical analysis on the drug war policy in Mexico. My name is Carlos Rodriguez and I'm the president of the Mexican Student Association hosting this event. Before we get started, I wanted to thank all of you for coming out today to hear and speak to us about this very sensitive issue, our panelists from traveling far and wide to this chat, and to our sponsors, SAC, SPEC, and the Penn Poli-Sci Department. With that said, today we have the honor to have among us three eminences on the topic that is defining the face of Mexico, the U.S., Latin America, and possibly the world as we know it. Started in Yale in 2007 and then hosted for the past 3 years by Mex at Penn, Convergencias is the annual university-wide conference on the challenges and opportunities that Mexico faces for its development. Despite the great success and achievements attained in the years past, the board decided to took a decision to change the format of the event, to cover the hot topic in our country, the drug war policy and the war on drugs. Today, all of us have the opportunity to question, validate, demystify our views on a topic that has affected every Mexican national's life in one way or another. Today, you as Penn students have the opportunity to learn what have been the benefits, cost, and viability of the measures the Mexican government has taken in respect to drug trafficking. Today, we have the opportunity to ask the tough questions on an extremely sensitive and important topic. The format of the event will be as follows. First, the first hour or so will be a panel interview where Lorenzo and Monica are going to ask predetermined questions talking about the political, institution, economic, social, and global implications of Felipe Calderon policy. This will then be followed by a Q&A portion with you. You have the opportunity to ask interesting questions to our panelists, who now Jose Pablo, Jose, and as Inigo have the opportunity to introduce. Thank you for coming once again.
Hi everyone. First I would like to introduce Edgardo Buscaglia. Edgardo Buscaglia received his legal postdoctoral training in jurisprudence and social policy at the University of California, Berkeley Law School. He also received a master's in law and economics and a PhD in economics from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where he was a Fulbright and ITT scholar. A fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and the Director of International Law and Economics Development Center. He lectures at the University of Virginia and is a visiting professor at the Law School of the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México. He serves as a legal economics senior advisor to several international organizations, bilateral institutions in the United States and in Europe, and the U.S. government.
Now I would like to introduce Carlos Elizondo Mayer-Serra. Carlos Elizondo received his PhD and his Master's in Philosophy and Political Science from the University of Oxford in the UK. Then from 1991 until 2004, he was professor and researcher at Centro de Investigación y Docencia Económica, CIDE, in Mexico. And from 1995 onwards until his appointment as permanent representative on May 2004, Mr. Elizondo was also Director General of CIDE. Since July 2001, Dr. Elizondo has been National Researcher of the Mexican National System of Researcher, SNI, and in 2004 was awarded with the highest level. He is author of numerous academic publications in the fields of Mexican politics, institutional and tax reforms in Mexico, and the political economy of structural reform in Mexico and Latin America. Thank you for coming.
Now I want to introduce Kevin Casas-Zamora. Casas-Zamora is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He earned his GD from the University of Costa Rica, his MA from the University of Essex, and his PhD from the University of Oxford, where his thesis was titled Paying for Democracy in Latin America, Political Finance and State Funding for Parties in Costa Rica and Uruguay. Most recently, Casas-Zamora served as Costa Rica Vice President, as well as Minister of National Planning and Economic Policy. Casas-Zamora has authored several studies on political finance, elections, citizen security, and civil-military relations in Latin America.
Okay, so we're going to begin now.
Again, thank you so much for being here. My name is Monica Hoffman and this is Lorenzo Lagos, and we're going to be your moderators for today. We're going to start with a very general question. We want to know what has led to such an increment in violence in recent years in Mexico. Any of you can answer.
Well, first of all, let me turn on the mic here. There we go. The violence in Mexico is not a random occurrence of just having organized crime moving around the country and killing people. Organized crime in Mexico, like in any other country in the world, organized crime obeys laws of behavior that are very predictable when you start assessing what drives organized crime. Now, organized crime is present all over the world. You have organized crime in Sweden, conducting trafficking of cars and cigarettes. You have organized crime in China. Every country in the world has different levels of organized crime. The difference is what is the scope and scale of organized crime and what is organized crime allowed to do. Now, when the state becomes weak, when the state is going through a process of political transition from one system to another, like it happened in Russia in the 1990s, like it happens in Mexico since the late 80s, I guess, you always have that kind of weakness of the state during that transition being exploited by organized crime. So they start to capture different areas of the state. And when they start capturing different areas of the state, police, prosecutors, then that weakness of the state hampers the capacity of the state to bring law and order. Law and order in the most basic sense, making sure that life and property are being protected. So you cannot understand violence in Mexico without understanding the nature of the political transition that Mexico is going through. So this is something that we may like to discuss later on, but the political transition in Mexico that has not been, there's no end in sight so far, because by not knowing exactly what the rules of the game that determine the allocation of power in Mexico, you can always state that the political transition is still going on. By not having this political transition with an end in sight, you can also say that the state is having a weakness, is experiencing a weakness that is hampering its capacity to enforce law and order, but not in the sense of more repression, in all senses. Prevention, law enforcement, and many other policies that we may discuss later on. But that seems to be a very short. What is the time usually that we have to take?
About 5 minutes would be...
So,
okay.
okay, that's all.
Yes, I mean, that's of course a very complicated question to answer, because violence in general, not just the violence that stems from organized crime. Violence in general is very difficult to explain. I mean, there's no silver bullet that one factor you can isolate to explain any spike in crime levels. In the case of Mexico, there are several reasons. I mean, one of them is the change in the political atmosphere in Mexico, and we can discuss that. But I think that the more interesting question is whether the current set of policies set in motion by President Calderon has contributed to the spike in violence levels that we're witnessing in Mexico. And that in itself is a very complex question. What I can tell you is that what we have seen over the past 2-3 years in Mexico is surely a reversal of a very clear downward trend in crime levels that Mexico had been experiencing over the previous 20 years or so. When you see the figures, the official figures and even victimization surveys in Mexico, crime levels more or less peaked in the early 90s, and then they started a remarkable downward trend that saw, for instance, that homicide rates in Mexico fell by almost half up until 2007. Then the trend changed in a very visible way. So, and this is just homicide rates, but actually when you broaden the scope and you see figures of kidnappings, figures of robberies, figures of all sorts of other offenses, you see more or less the same phenomenon. So it really makes you wonder. I don't have a straight answer to that question, but I have the impression that whether it was necessary or not, the current set of policies has exacerbated a violence problem that surely was there before the current administration took over, but it was more or less under control. Even if you take a closer look at homicide rates in the states that have been most affected by violence over the past 3 or 4 years, what you see is that even in a place like Chihuahua, murder rates were either stable or going down since the early 2000s. So it is inevitable to get the impression that President Calderon, for reasons that are very complicated, kicked a hornet's nest. Whether that spike in violence levels is necessary for an ulterior purpose or not, is the jury's still out on that one.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with the two of you. Thanks for this invitation. I would continue with what Kevin said, giving a little bit more, some data, which will put into context the question that was asked. Although I agree that at the end, the transition must explain part of this problem, the interesting thing is that for whatever, up until 2007, transition was associated with less murders. That is to say, in 1992, we were having a rate of 20 murders around per each 100,000 inhabitants. In 2006, 8 per 100,000 inhabitants. Deep decline. We were much closer to the US trends than to other Latin American trends. That is to say, the US in the year 2007 was having 6 per 100,000 murders. So if you looked at Mexico's trend, it looked we were converging into the US rate of murder in a quite surprising way. In fact, no one had really studied this until Fernando Escalante wrote an article in Nexos, Revista Nexos, a couple of years ago, and many were surprised because we were already discussing how violent and unstable Mexico is. It was not then. But very quickly, he wrote a new article this January where he shows an amazing rate of growth, perhaps the most amazing change for a country which is formally not in a civil war, we moved from 8 per 100,000 inhabitants to almost 19 in 2 years. So in 2 years, we lost what we had gained in 18 years. So there's a question there. What happened? Government's argument would be things started to deteriorate, and there are some graphs in Fernando's article, which I strongly recommend, which has a very suggestive name in Spanish, La muerte tiene permiso, murder is allowed. The government would argue, if you look at the state of Michoacán, violence started, governors asked us to intervene because we were losing control over the basic functions of government that Edgardo just very briefly explained. We entered, and in all cases where the government entered, there's a first downward move, then it goes back. In the case of Michoacán, it goes back to the peak it had gained when the government intervened. In the case of Ciudad Juárez, it gets wild, crazy. What explains Ciudad Juárez getting crazy? What explains Michoacán stabilizing on very high levels, but still stabilizing? Or what explains the very acute difference between Tijuana, where the intervention of the government created a spike, then it returned, and Tijuana is the only city in the northern part of Mexico which is right now much better than 2 years ago, while Ciudad Juárez got wild. Those are the kind of questions I think we should try to understand, because it's the same federal government following very similar policies. What happened? What's taking place at the local level, at the state level, at the municipal level that explains this? Fernando Escalante would argue that the main problem is that in some places of Mexico we lost the mechanism we lost municipal police, which is the vehicle for managing violence and crime. All local police are more or less corrupt. The question is who controls them and how corrupted they are. We all know that in any place in the US, I'm sure you know in this room, where in Philadelphia you can buy whatever or do whatever kind of things. The police, of course, knows also. The question is, how do you manage that? When do these police forces start corrupting not only your chief officer, but perhaps your president municipal or your governor? The federal government will claim that they intervened because that was taking place. Extreme example, Michoacán, where this gang, serious violent gang called La Familia, which is of course some sort of counterintuitive term, but La Familia argued that they were there to represent citizens and exercise the basic functions of government. The government entered Michoacán because the governor asked them to enter there. Is it working? Why is it working better in Tijuana? Why isn't it working at all in Chihuahua? I think those are the kind of issues that might organize this discussion.
Can I figure out on that one? Or Eduardo?
We can return to the same. Yeah.
Okay. I just, to elaborate a little bit more Carlos's point, I think that one of the crucial questions in this whole discussion is whether the diagnosis of the problem is right. And particularly when it comes to one. I have the impression that a large part of the strategy of the current administration in Mexico in order to deal with the problem of organized crime is based upon the notion that the basic problem that the government is trying to solve is a problem of lack of effective control over the territory on the part of the state. That the state doesn't have effective control over the territory. And therefore, when you're in such a situation, and that was the case basically in Colombia. You had a state that had large chunks of its territory outside any kind of official control. In that kind of situation, it's only natural to send in the military, to reestablish the state's control over the territory. When you look at the figures, you find a more complicated story, because if you take the 10 states that have been more affected by violence in 2010, by drug-related violence in 2010 in Mexico, what you find is that most of them have human development figures, human development indicators, which is a proxy of sorts for the provision of public goods, basic public goods and services, that are well above the median, the average for the country, for Mexico as a whole. What you find is that the majority of those 10 states have ratios of police to population that are either above or identical to the ratio that you find in the US. So what I'm trying to get at is that these places don't seem to me, don't appear as God-forsaken lands where public goods and services are not provided. They don't seem to be outside the effective control of the state. My impression is that rather than a problem of territorial or of lack of territorial control, what you have in Mexico is a problem of state capture, which is a different animal. It's a problem of the penetration of public institutions, particularly law enforcement institutions, by organized crime through means of corruption and coercion. But that's a problem that, for the most part, you cannot solve sending in the military. I leave it at that.
Yeah. Look, in order to generate a convergence among the three positions, we have worked with the UN, far from being my credit. We have 750 people working all over the world trying to determine what are the common denominators that explain what you have just described so well. And usually you find 4 elements that shine by their absence in countries where organized crime experiences the same kind of evolution like the one you described. I agree with you that a state capture in Mexico, you literally have an incredible amount of police authorities working for organized crime, being part of organized crime. And let me define the animal better than so far I have done. We're talking about organized crime involved in 22 types of crimes, not just drugs. So human trafficking, extortion, etc. So when you look at all those indicators, you find a very complex picture. It's not just drugs. And the 4 elements that need to be present in order to reduce organized crime in the way that Colombia has done and Russia has done outside the rule of law is you need to have prevention, social prevention, at the same time operating with improvements in law enforcement, a professional police force working in accordance to basic standards that we can discuss later. You need to have the capacity of parties, the political actors, to self-restrain, in other words, to avoid being captured by organized crime. It has to be an internal, endogenous, not based on prosecutors, not based on police. So the political class needs to self-restrain itself in order not to be captured like it's captured in Mexico. And you need to have a lot of civil asset forfeiture. In other words, money laundering laws that are being applied in a much larger scale than so far has done. All those elements are absent in Mexico, which explains why organized crime has expanded its scale and scope in these 22 types of crimes, non-stop during the entire period from the transition onwards. The difference is that now the state is not able to manage organized crime like it used to happen before. You see, in the old days, in the tree, and this is not my, I have interviewed many of the old animals in the tree, the dinosaurios, like they call them in Mexico, dinosaurs. They used to manage these guys. Organized crime was managed by the state, gestionado. Like now Putin is doing in Russia. Putin is managing organized crime. I can tell you stories about why weapons do not reach Afghanistan from Russia, because the Russian state is making sure that organized crime in Russia operates within certain boundaries. The same thing used to happen in Mexico. Mexico used to have a state that was able to manage organized crime. But when the political transition starts, the capacity of the state to manage those groups goes down the drain. And you start the other way around. Organized crime starts managing the state. So the state now in Mexico looks like a jigsaw puzzle. Every piece of the state is captured by different organized crime groups. So the state is paralyzed. I always say that this is not a central planning from Los Pinos where the president is involved in this corruption. We never argue that. The state is captured like it happened in Russia in the 1990s. So you do have a capture of the state. We wrote a piece with several colleagues of ours. The piece is titled "The Paradox of Expected Punishment." And here there's another convergence with what you just said, the two of you, a few minutes ago. When you just throw soldiers and more repression against organized crime without taking away their assets, without a social preventive framework to address all this poverty and gangs, when you just throw more soldiers, more repression, what organized crime does all over the world, it used to happen in Colombia, in Russia, and Afghanistan, is that they react with all that money, untouched, by increasing violence and increasing corruption. So it's a paradox. The paradox is more police, more violence. More police, more prosecutors, more corruption. So that's called the paradox of expected punishment. There's an article in the International Review of Law and Economics published last year that takes 107 countries, and we prove that that paradox is operating worldwide when governments only send soldiers after this criminal enterprises. Don't forget, these are criminal enterprises. By capturing the physical human beings, you will not solve this problem. You need to dismantle the whole network, the whole political and economic network that includes logistics, distribution, transportation, production. It's an enterprise. So if you're not touching that, and you're just sending more soldiers and soldiers with the best willpower, the president, I'm sure, has the best will, you will just increase the levels of violence and corruption as a result. Because it's a rational way that organized crime will defend itself. They're trying to neutralize all those prosecutors and police that they see coming towards them. So that's why, to some degree, you have this increased violence that agrees with your point. I think you made that point, that the remedy, the medicine, has been worse than the illness at the same time. You see what I mean? The policy, doesn't matter how well-intentioned, has backfired into this higher levels of violence that you see now. So, to some degree, we find agreement, so we can project some story here that makes sense. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for your insights. Now we want to move to a contentious issue also that involves the United States. The question is legalization a viable option? The legalization of drugs. Could you please touch on that issue?
Shall I do?
You go first.
I will go, but just 2 words on what you two said at the previous session, very quickly. I won't get punished by our moderators. I expected punishment very high. First, it is absolutely true that state has been captured, but we might want to make some qualifications on what do we mean by that. That is to say, it's not the same thing the municipal police of Tijuana, where you probably are captured, but still you have enough control to regulate what's going on, than what happened in Ciudad Juárez when it was completely on the control of organized crime. And it's not the same thing the Armada, the Marine, where you are more or less isolated, than El Ejército, which is probably more corrupted. Or it's not the same thing the Policía Federal now than 3 years before, where it was probably much more captured, and now it's much less, and it has a stronger area of autonomy. So in that sense, I think that we might want to exactly qualify a little bit. The second thing I would like to say with respect to the first points that were discussed here is that the nature of the organized crime changed regardless of what the government was doing or not doing during the past years. Why? Because of the changes in Colombia, Mexican drug organizations were like subcontratados, sub-hired by the Colombians. When the Colombians started to be destroyed or disorganized by the Colombian army, then our mafias became stronger. They started to control more territory. They started to do different things, started to be much more bold, and because they had been capable of buying and coercing state governors or even some federal agencies, they were moving each time doing worse things without any limit. And if you again look at Michoacán was a desperate cry by Governor Lázaro Cárdenas for President Calderón, please help me because I cannot go even to outside of my Palacio Municipal because la familia is governing. There's perhaps less of a plan and a lot much more of necessity. Now, let me move to the question.
Say a two-finger on that one.
Yeah.
You're going to punch.
We could talk about that later.
It's a two-finger. I mean, it's 10 seconds. About this. I'm losing my train of thought. You see? Never.
We can come back to it if you need to.
Well, now the specific question.
Legalization.
Mexico is in one of the worst possible conditions in terms of geography for this specific issue, which is U.S. demanding drugs and U.S. allowing arms at a very liberal, with very liberal institutions. And as some argue, after 2004, liberalizing even assault weapons. I don't know if Edgardo has some data on that, but I've heard people that say because of that liberalization, organized crime get access to new arms, much more powerful arms, and that might be behind this spike. I'm not saying I know it's for true, but that's something that should be looked at with some detail. So we have this arbitrage problem. Ciudad Juárez is the most violent city in Mexico City. El Paso is probably the third most safe city in the U.S. Same population, same gangs, but they're different institutions. And of course, if you're a gang leader and want to kill someone, where would you kill it? In El Paso or in Ciudad Juárez? You kill it in Ciudad Juárez, obviously. Why? Because it's a weak state where you can solve these kind of problems. So it makes things much more complex. But the question has a very specific point, which is, would legalizing drugs help? I think that in the long run it would help if you do it in the appropriate way, trying to create the support for, in terms of public health, trying to avoid massive consumption, etc., etc. But in the short run it won't change. Even if we were to legalize completely marijuana today, it won't change because these mafias are already organized. They already have 22 areas of activities. So you cannot legalize human trafficking. I hope no one is wanting to legalize human trafficking. So they would continue doing illegal things in those areas that have to be illegal. And I am sure Edgardo knows much more what are the percentage of resources they gain from marijuana trafficking. It could help changing the trend in the long run, but in the short run, I don't think that it would help. What helps is what Edgardo has already said. Stronger institutions, no doubt, but not only stronger institutions. You need to go after the money. Edgardo has described and advocated for this sort of institutional changes where you have stronger states capable of taking out part of their income. Thirdly, you need much more political coordination between major actors, and of course you need social policy as well, which is the same thing with respect to legalizing drugs. If we were to have today the best social policy possible in Ciudad Juárez, we still have a lot of inertia as a result of the many years of tolerating young people organizing in gangs and not giving them any other opportunity.
Well, fully agree. Legalization of drugs, first of all, has to be, from a public policy standpoint, taken as a public health measure. It should not be conceived as a measured against organized crime. That's a premise that all of us who have been studying the experience of Portugal since 2001, for example, take a look at the experience of Portugal, because Portugal since 2001 has taken away the consumption of drugs from the criminal justice system and has been experiencing, contrary to what many predicted, a decrease in the consumption of drugs as a result of those measures implemented since 2001. The European Union provides a wonderful example of countries with different rules applied to the consumption of drugs. In Germany, for example, you have administrative sanctions. The common denominator is that you're not going to go to jail. That's fine. Now, that's very good from a public health standpoint. Takes away resources from sending people to jail, away from sending people to jail for drug consumption into the areas where those resources are mostly needed, complex crimes and so on and so forth. But there's two common denominators. I always go to the international experience to give you some guidance that explain when legalization of consumption works. That is a bad term, actually. It's decriminalization. In other words, you're taking away the consumption from the criminal justice domain. When does it work in terms of reducing consumption? That's the public health objective. Reducing consumption, reducing addiction. People are healthier. That's basically the goal of legalizing, in quotes. Two things need to happen in order for that consumption of drugs to go down after you legalize. One, you need to have social prevention in place through the educational system, through the health system, through the labor system, the labor markets. In other words, you need to have prevention in place to prevent that kids, very young kids, will have access to those drugs and consume it. Second, you need to have the state capable of regulating the product. Mexico is not capable of regulating basic pharmaceutical products at this point. So we cannot even imagine that they will be actually addressing the regulation of drugs in the way that is being proposed. If you don't have those two elements and you legalize, I keep repeating in quotes, consumption will increase after you legalize. This is, I'm not bringing public morals, I'm not bringing value judgments into this. It's a public policy conclusion. You need to have the preventive and regulatory framework in place with a state capable of implementing those two frameworks before you just go ahead and legalize the whole theory. And then there's an excellent point that Carlos just made, that is organized crime is so diversified at this point in Mexico, recognized by the Pentagon a few weeks ago, that if you legalize or not legalize marijuana, it will not make much of a difference in the short and medium term. But that's a secondary argument. I'm not even using that argument for now. I'm just using the public health argument. The fact that you want to prevent having kids, 10-year-olds, having access to drugs after you make those drugs more accessible and subject to that. So Mexico does not comply with the two institutional requirements so far. So we have to build institutions before we even think about generating laws to legalize drugs. I hope this is clear for now. But.
Yeah, now I remember the point I was trying to make, and then I'm going to go into legalization. The point I was ready to make before was that I don't want to give the impression, I'm pretty sure that none of us wants to give the impression that the violence that is taking place in Mexico is all the government's fault. I think that to some extent, some of the violence that is taking place in Mexico would have happened regardless. And perhaps to a different, in a different order of magnitude, but it would have happened regardless. Bear in mind that a lot of the casualties that are happening in Mexico are because of cartel-on-cartel violence. I mean, it is the drug trafficking organizations killing people from the other drug trafficking organizations. And probably some of it would have happened regardless. As for legalization, I totally agree with what has been said here. I guess the first question that we need to ask, because people, peddle this notion of legalization as a quick fix, and the story is much more complicated. I mean, the first thing that you have to ask yourself is legalization of what? Because it is one thing to consider legalizing marijuana, and a whole different ball game considering legalizing heroin. And I guess when you go around and ask public officials in different countries in Latin America, and not just in Latin America, the objections raised against legalizing marijuana are far fewer than those that are present when you talk about legalizing hard drugs. And the second thing is, and the second question is, when we talk about legalizing, we talk about legalizing what activities? Because ultimately, no one is thinking of legalizing, large-scale trade in drugs. I mean, even countries that have traveled very far in down the route of decriminalizing the personal consumption, they crack very hard on large-scale trade in drugs. So it is the question of what we legalize is crucial, and it's not easy to answer. The second thing is that, to be entirely honest, I mean, we have bits and pieces of information about the effects of legalization, but no one knows for sure what the effect will be, quite frankly. I mean, to some extent, it will be a jump into the void. And that's why, I feel rather uneasy with this cavalier attitude of advocating legalization as a quick fix, because quite frankly, we know very little about what the effect would be. And number three is the big issue that legalization presupposes a kind of collective action problem between countries. The big question here is who's going to do it first, because no one wants to do it first. Because there are certain specific problems that will fall upon whichever country gives this first step. And I guess that the only realistic way to go about this is to do it in a coordinated fashion between countries. Otherwise, I find it difficult to see, that any country will want to give the first step, quite frankly. And all that goes to say, and I'm playing devil's advocate here, because at a basic intuitive level, I find it attractive. I find the idea of legalization attractive. But I think it's much more complicated than we're being told by certain people that peddle this notion, with little consideration for the consequences.
Thank you. Do you want to say anything?
No, I agree. I mean, if you take any economics 101 textbook, it's a no-brainer. You should legalize. But the public policy, for those of us who are advising real decision makers on this issue, the world is not that simple. We cannot just go with textbooks and say, go ahead. There are several areas of unplanned consequences that could impede the reduction in consumption. I keep insisting, you need to know exactly what your objective variable is. What is your objective variable here? Destroy the Sinaloa cartel or reduce consumption of drugs? Well, when you take the public health perspective, then you can assess the consequences like Portugal is doing right now. But I fully agree with what you just said. I don't know.
I agree.
You want to say anything?
No, I agree.
Thank you. So, as you mentioned, this is obviously not confined just to Mexico. We want to know what has been the effect of the war in Central America, and how has this affected migration through Mexico?
Or you should ask. You should start that one.
That one first. Well, it's dire. It's terrible. I mean, the situation in Central America has deteriorated quite significantly over the past few years, and certainly over the past 2 or 3 years. I mean, the changes are taking place very rapidly. And the real problem here is that we're talking about very small countries with very, very weak states, almost, according to almost any variable that you choose to measure them against. And it is very plausible to argue that the Central American countries have much more limited capacity to deal with the phenomenon of organized crime than Mexico does. And in some Central American countries, and I'm thinking here particularly of Guatemala and to some extent Honduras, you may argue that besides the problem of state capture, they do have a real problem of lack of territorial control. I mean, which, by the way, is intertwined with very significant and very profound development issues that these countries have. Think of Guatemala. Guatemala is a country that collects 10% of GDP in taxes. 10%. That's among the lowest figures in the world.
Like Mexico, but without oil.
Without the oil. I mean, 10% is all. 10% of GDP is all that the Guatemalan state has to provide public goods and services. So it is no wonder, no one can be really surprised that the Guatemalan state has serious problems to exert effective control over the territory. A state that collects 10% of GDP in taxes is a state that in practical terms doesn't go beyond the cities. Okay? So we're talking here, in the case of Guatemala and to some extent Honduras, of states that have not just a problem of state capture and corruption, rampant corruption, but also an objective problem of lack of territorial control. So the situation in Central America is very dire. Crime rates are going through the roof in Central America, particularly in the northern part of Central America, Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. Much of it linked to organized crime in different ways. Just to give you an idea, those three countries, the northern half of Central America is by far, by a considerable margin, the most violent region in the world outside of an active war zone. Last year, and believe me, my jaw fell to the floor when I saw this. Last year, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, each of them had more murders than the 27 countries of the European Union combined. So it's not looking good. It's not looking good, and so far, Central America has remained pretty much under the radar screen of this whole discussion. That's sort of changing over the past year or so. At least in Washington, you begin to see more interest and more attention paid to Central America. But when it comes to things like the allocation of money, the money that comes from the U.S. government to assist the region to fight organized crime, Central America is by far getting the short end of the stick. If you take the figures of the money that has been allocated within the umbrella of the Merida Initiative and the post-Merida Initiative over the past 4 years, Central America has barely, the 7 countries of Central America have barely been allocated about 20% of the total funding, which is, it's a distribution that I find indefensible if you take into account the vulnerabilities of the region and the sheer magnitude of the challenge these countries are facing in organized crime.
Well, thank you. Actually, since we're running short in time, we want to address one question to each of the panelists. So this
We talk too much, okay.
This one is for Dr. Elizondo. So, is education a more fundamental problem than drug trafficking?
Well, in a way, it is more fundamental, of course. But let me put it this way. The first thing a state has to solve is having some basic control over its territory, avoiding criminal institutions capable of challenging, desafiarlos, confront them. And if you don't solve that, all the rest is a little bit uninteresting. So in that sense, it's more important not drug trafficking, but organized crime, which includes, as Edgardo has said, many other things than drug trafficking only. But of course, you could argue as well that with better education, etc., the incentives for moving into the sicarios ladder of organized crime would be less. Although, as Kevin said very, very clearly a moment ago, Chihuahua has quite decent rate of education, etc., when compared to Chiapas, and still the problem is in Chihuahua and not in Chiapas. So the idea that the education by itself will solve the problem is a little bit naive. So it's really a question of having a strategy with different fronts where you start the state building at different levels. State building shouldn't be understood only as they have more policemen or more arms. You have to have education, health, options to people, etc. Just say a few words, although I'll be punished, on what Kevin said, which I fully agree most on all of what he said. Let's just put two things in context. One, in terms of murders, Guatemala now has a rate of around 60 per 100,000 inhabitants. Mexico has 19, as I said previously. And it's going up. It was 20 like 3 years ago. So the trend is horrendous. Mexican army hasn't entered to Guatemala, so we cannot blame the Mexican army directly for that fight. The Mexican army has increased the cost of doing business in Mexico, and just as it's easier to do things in Ciudad Juárez than in El Paso, the more successful Mexico is, the more we will find the Zetas operating from, which is what's dominating, the Zetas operating from Guatemala, creating a horrible problem. And Guatemala, with its 60 murders per 100,000 inhabitants, has a rate slightly higher than Chihuahua, which has around 50. The state of Chihuahua in Mexico. The difference being that they cannot call the army. So the situation becomes extremely unstable in the short run. Guatemala might be the most evident place where things are getting very, very nasty. Honduras as well. Salvador is less, they have a stronger police. And I would like
to... It's a smaller country with less problems of territorial control.
Very fast. In order for this perfect storms to happen in all these regions, like in Central America, you need to have several problems, several elements overlapping. Several things need to occur at the same time. On the one hand, Central America has this past of civil wars that to some degree the actors that are now playing a very important role in Central American organized crime in alliance with the Zetas, not to take all the blame away from Mexico, are actors that were also very much present during the civil wars in the 80s, former military and stuff like that. So that's one element of the perfect storm. The perfect storm doesn't occur just because one thing happens. You need to have several things happening at the same time. Then you have this background of extreme poverty. And, it's very cheap, the opportunity cost, like economists call it, of going into a gang are extremely low. So you have these hundreds of thousands of kids flowing like ants into the hands of gangs, and that's a very cheap labor force for organized crime. Now you're seeing many of these transnational gangs that maybe originated in the U.S., by the way,
in Los Angeles,
but they're operating in Central America with an incredible cheap source of labor coming from very young people there. Then you need to have the wrong policies at the same time, because there's mistakes made within the policy domain are always present. So Central America is a case of a perfect storm with several ingredients that need to be there at the same time. And I'm not an expert on Central American history, but I can sense that some of that is explaining much of this.
The geographical position, too.
The balloon effect that you have.
Exactly. I mean, that and also as a result of the civil wars, the region is totally flooded with guns.
Yeah, that's fine.
I mean, that's 77% of all murders in Central America are committed with a gun. No other region in the world has that sort of figure. So, I mean, it's a perfect storm.
But again, this strange contrast. Chiapas is currently a relatively peaceful state.
Yeah.
Guatemala is not. Why? Because the weak state is.
I can tell you why. It's a relatively peaceful state.
In part because of the Zapatistas. Right.
Part of that, and part of the fact that the authorities, Mariano Ran, remember Mariano Ran, used to tell me the story, the Attorney General of Chiapas used to tell us the story of how they used to manage organized crime locally. So you had this old-fashioned visits from public officials to organized crime bosses, telling them, hey, you know, if you operate in this area and you do A, B, and C, we will not go after you. Now, if you break these limits, we will... So the Chiapas government has been trying to manage organized crime in the old-fashioned way.
Although Mariano is currently in prison.
Mariano is currently in prison, but has not been killed by organized crime.
Can I a very short finger on the previous question about, you know, this a false dichotomy that you have to choose to do either education or fight organized crime. A government has to be able to walk and twig at the same time. However, having said that, and acknowledging that education is more, as a matter of principle, is more important. When you're in government, and I was for a time, the sad thing is that urgent beats important 9 times out of 10. You end up dealing with the urgent problem, regardless of whether it's the more important of the two or not. And that's something they have to bear in mind. And anyone who's been, who spent a time in office will tell you the same thing, I'm sure.
Thank you. This is going to be the last question before we open it up to you guys and take questions from you. The question is, how globalized do you feel this issue has become in the past few years, and how has it affected Africa and the Middle East, for example?
Well, here we do have data, because what we do is we consolidate all this information coming from financial intelligence units from all over the world, case files handled by judicial systems, police, prosecutors, and judges from many countries that are willing to work with us. We work with the UPOL, with Interpol, so we have data that can give us a sense of the presence of Mexican organized crime abroad. That's the question, right? I mean, the presence of Mexican organized crime all over the world. And so far, the latest count is that there are case files open in 52 countries investigating the presence of Mexican organized crime, including Western Africa. That has been confirmed by the U.S. government after some time, including Bulgaria and Romania, 2 countries in the European Union with very low levels of governance. Doesn't surprise me. Including Albania, outside the European Union. So you have 3 main reasons for Mexican organized crime, main reasons 3 to develop this tactical or strategic alliances with criminal groups in other countries. One is obviously the provision of inputs. I mean, they need to get a hold of the coca leaves or get a hold of the ingredients in order to produce artificial drugs. And they do that from countries, not one imagines Bolivia, of course, Peru, but very far away. India, for example, is a provider of inputs for the Sinaloa cartel. South Korea. So you have that these guys, the Sinaloa cartel members, don't place all the eggs in one basket. They like to diversify their sources.
It's a good corporation.
It's a good corporation. Yes, yes.
So, and that's a point that we have to bear in mind all the time. I mean, we're talking about extremely sophisticated operations.
Yeah.
You know, these guys, because they have the money, they can hire the most talented chemist, the most talented financial advisors, the most talented lawyers. I mean, this is a very difficult creature to subdue.
Yeah, and the second reason for the presence is the case of Central America. They have logistics bases. They bring the drugs. They need to have storage, a place to store the drugs, to store the human beings, to store the weapons. So they need to have some logistics infrastructure. So some countries provide that. Central America is an example. And then the typical case where they need to protect the assets. Remember, the main goal of organized crime is making money. If they can make money peacefully, is much more of a better deal for them than making money through violence. So violence for organized crime is not a good deal. They lose money. There are some interesting studies by other colleagues who have studied organized crime in Russia, in the US, where they find out how much money organized crime loses because of violence among each other. So keep in mind, this is a criminal enterprise. Violence is not the objective. The objective is making money, so they need this third type of countries to hide their assets in a very peaceful and well-protected environment. That's why the European Union is such an attractive place, especially when within the European Union you have countries with low levels of governance, like Bulgaria and Romania. So you have the protection of the European Union, but with a lot of corruption inside. Yeah.
And I would add something. That's what they did in parts of Mexico. That's why they entered originally to Monterrey, because it was a good place where to park their assets. And suddenly that equilibrium is lost and you start destroying their assets.
Yeah. So 52 countries where this guy so far are being investigated. I'm not talking about judicial rulings with a final sentence. Investigated. So this has gone up. The number is not just interesting. You have to see the dynamics of that number. And from 2003, they have gone from a dozen countries, 13, 12, to what is now 52. 3 years ago, when I started to talk a lot about this with you, remember, there were 40-something. So they are expanding. They're expanding worldwide, and they're acquiring the same level of, the same profile that the Russian organized crime groups were famous for in the 1990s, where they started to expand worldwide. So the dynamics is very similar in that respect. So short and sweet. So there we go.
Can I say,
Of course.
again, a short elaboration of a point, a very important point just made by Edgardo, which is that the ultimate goal of all this is money. And sadly, when you see, and this is a point that Edgardo has been making very consistently, when you see the allocation of the funding within the Merida umbrella, for instance, take one example, the proportion of the assistance that is allocated to this kind of angle to tackle the organized problem beast is very, very limited. I mean, that's, in terms of the strategy, both of the Mexican government and the U.S. government, I would say that the weakest link is what is being done at the moment when it comes to money laundering and the handling of assets by organized crime.
No doubt about it. No doubt about
It's
it.
the weakest link by far.
And this is a shared responsibility. The DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, needs to share responsibility for the failures of policy implementation in Mexico. We have on the record statements by former directors, by the chief of operations of the DEA in Washington, D.C., supporting all this nonsense of more repression, more helicopters, more soldiers for quite a long time. When people within the U.S. administration has been openly criticizing that approach. So the very limited amount of flow of resources towards civil asset forfeitures. When I say civil, I mean non-criminal cases. That is, people take the state takes away your house from you without engaging in any kind of criminal case. You don't go to jail. The assets are taken away from the criminal enterprise. Then you have a criminal case separately, but you need to engage with organized crime on a non-criminal justice system basis. You need to take away those assets. Most of you imagine organized crime with guns and all these ugly faces on. I promise you, it's much more sophisticated than that. You have this thousands of very sophisticated businesses involved in organized crime, and most of these actors never saw a gun in their lives. These are people, very sophisticated people who participate in meetings within the Chamber of Commerce. They're all over the place. You need to identify that network and dismantle it. And this is something that Mexico is not doing enough. And I'm very saddened by that, because U.S. authorities should have a much more powerful role in making sure that those assets, those resources from Merida and beyond flow to the right places. And they haven't done so yet.
Okay, thank you very much. So we'll be taking questions.
You have about an hour to ask questions.
Oh, I can say it talk louder then. Regarding the legalization, is it viable to treat the drug cartels as businesses and open the doors to international corporations such as GlaxoSmithKline and Bayer to compete against the drug cartels and use the money saved from combating these illegal activities to fund social prevention and state regulation?
Should we take a round of 3 questions, and then, or should we go one by one?
I think one by one.
One by one, you like it?
Yeah.
The whole idea is to, people always colleagues bring the example of legalizing alcohol after this law here in the U.S. In the 1930s. The idea, of course, is that you will take away all these resources that are being wasted right now within the penitentiary system, within the justice system. You will take away those resources and reallocate them to fighting real crime. And the idea is fascinating, and it works out quite well, as long as you take this legalization, as I said, as a public health issue. The idea of having legal enterprises, pharmaceutical companies producing drugs, and again, we have to look at which drugs we're going to be talking about, because drugs that have a very powerful negative impact on health cannot be simply legalized and allowed to be accessible in the way that marijuana is. As long as you have a very limited scope of legalization and you regulate, like I said before, that market, in other words, in the same way you regulate any other type of medicine that you buy over the counter or not, then of course you will have a very powerful effect on improving public health and at the same time taking away profits from organized crime in the traditional sense. Now, don't forget that in many cases, given the fact that you have a huge merge between organized crime, in the way you see it in the newspaper, and legal enterprises, it is very feasible for them to be part of that market, be part of the legal market through the legal enterprises that they already control. Many of the, they call it piracy or pirate industry, pharmaceutical industry in India, is controlled by organized crime nowadays. So your solution will also find itself in the hands of organized crime. It will be benefiting organized crime to some degree. You see what I'm trying to say? So you have to know very well, and that's what I meant, that the state needs to have the capacity to regulate the production and the sale of these drugs before you jump into these kinds of magic bullets that are not magic bullets, of course. I mean, they will not solve all the problems at the same time.
What do you think of this new policy that sets a limit on the transactions that can be performed in dollars in Mexico? Do you think it's a good way to mitigate this laundering of money? I know there's other sources where it can
And you also give a general context, so not alone. Well, like 1 year ago, the government put limits on the amount of dollars you could exchange in the bank system and through the Casas-Zamora, the exchange houses, with the idea of increasing the cost for drug dealers to transform their revenues into pesos. And it has to be said because there was a huge imbalance in the amount of cash the Mexican banks were sending to the U.S. that could not be explained by remittances, by other cash-generating activities like tourism. They had to be linked to organized crime. And they were facing a serious problem, as you might know, which was that only 2 U.S. banks were accepting those, if I remember correctly, $12 billion in cash that was transferred from the Mexican banks each year to the U.S. in armored cars. It's quite a logistic problem to send those dollars back. And of course, because of anti-laundering laws in the U.S., it was difficult for U.S. banks to accept that cash. So there was, in this context, not only with respect to the specific aim of limiting the possibility of organized crime to transform their dollars into pesos, that the decision was taken to limit quite sharply the amount of dollars that you can transform into pesos in the Mexican economy. So it makes sense because, of course, you have to make it more difficult and make it more traceable, because now you can, when you do it, you have to register yourself, etc. So there is a process which makes sense of make people go through the banking system. But it's just a minute part of the problem. You would need extremely more ambitious laws, which are currently, in fact, there was a government initiative that was sent to the Senate in September, if I remember correctly, with the idea of increasing the controls. Let me give you some examples, which gives you an idea of how weak the laws are, and therefore the capacity of the state to regulate money. In most countries, serious countries I know, you cannot buy a house with a bag full of money. In Mexico, it's legal to do it right now. It means the notario, the attorney has to, in principle, certify where those resources come, but they usually don't do it. And so it's an easy mechanism to clean, to launder your money. And it's been very convenient always for tax evasion and all those kind of issues. So this law would aim to control much more where can you use cash and when you have to use banking instruments in such a way that you leave a register of where those resources came, and we now have this tax on cash deposit in the Mexican system. So you start creating the administrative systems that will allow you to, if you do the intelligence, which they are not doing as they should, but if you do the intelligence, to start mapping and tracking which are these enterprises that can be linked to organized crime, etc., etc. It's part of a strategy which has been very limited, which was triggered because this pressure that we would be incapable of selling our cash to the U.S., we needed to move in that direction, but the whole package hasn't yet passed in Congress. And why is it difficult that it will pass? Why is it so difficult for President Calderon to push this legislation in Congress? In a big degree because politics in Mexico require a lot of cash. means elections in Mexico require a lot of cash. Corruption of public officials require a lot of cash. So politicians in itself, especially politicians at the local level in certain parties, are not very keen with the idea of having all these controls used potentially against them as well. So as Edgardo said very quickly in one of his presentations, you need political parties to internalize the risk they are, as a political class, paying or could be paying because of lack of these institutional controls, and perhaps pay a cost internally because some of the members of your party might be part of this problem. But you need to isolate the political class in order to have more capacity to confront organized crime.
You open a huge new area for discussion because it goes straight into this self-restraint. Remember that I mentioned that the political class needs to self-restrain. Sure. And political campaigns in Mexico nowadays are incredibly expensive. Most of those campaigns are being funded through illegal means, according to military intelligence in Mexico. I have publicly said this. And the measures to counteract that require a political agreement among all the political forces in Mexico. And if you have a weak government, because of the fact that Calderón has never enjoyed this majority in Congress that could allow him to, like Uribe did in Colombia, drag the opposition towards this new rules of the game. If you don't have that political pact, political agreement, it's very hard to implement this measure. Most campaigns in Mexico, political campaigns, are being funded through legal enterprises. You don't see the Chapo Guzman coming with money. You see all these legal enterprises buying goods and services for the politician, the local politician, and through those legal businesses, you see a lot of infiltration of organized crime. Now, engaging in a real battle against money laundering would involve a huge offensive against that kind of funding. And in order for that to happen, you need to have the agreement of the political class behind doors, behind closed doors. I'm not talking about public hugs and public ceremonies. I'm talking about real agreements. In Colombia, the arrival of the Uribe administration with considerable political weight allowed their Congress to go ahead in the implementation of these measures. As a result of that, more than 30% of the national legislators in Colombia have been indicted for links with organized crime. So that is a real cleanup, but it's not the result of having new prosecutors or judges who are geniuses or policemen who are Elliot Ness. No, it requires the political class to realize that they have to change the rules of the game because the abyss is in front of them. And if the political class doesn't come to this collective realization that the abyss is in front of them, and they have to change the rules in the way that Carlos just mentioned, this orgy of violence and corruption will not end in Mexico, unfortunately. It's about money, it's about business, and this is something that needs to be done. So I agree. We conducted with the Instituto Iglesias, Enrique, we conducted an assessment of this proposal a few weeks ago, and the government and obviously the legislative proposal was considered insufficient, not just by me, but by the whole panel of...
For you, insufficient. For the Senate, too much.
Yeah.
Can I just say something very quickly about the issue of cash and how the handling of cash affects all this? I do think that plastic money is a big part of the solution. I mean, to the extent that you reduce the uses of cash, the legitimate uses of cash in an economy, you stand a better chance of dealing with money laundering and all this. But that begs the previous question, which is, again, one of those examples in which all decisions are intertwined with very basic development issues in our countries. You would be surprised how limited the penetration of financial systems is in places like Central America. I mean, the proportion of people that have a bank account and therefore can have plastic money, it's very limited. I mean, a large proportion of the financial activities in many countries in Latin America happens outside the formal financial system. So therefore, I mean, one of the things that needs to be done in order to reduce the amount of cash is to, bring a lot of people that are outside the formal financial channels into the formal financial system. I mean, and to expand the range of the range and the scope of the financial institutions and banks, and there are some ways to go because it's still a pending issues in a lot of Latin American countries.
I wanted to know how you view the prospect of 2012 with the Mexican presidential elections, and kind of what road should be taken. Should this policy be continued and altered, or would it be better to kind of lay off? With that, the impression kind of like the bad guys won and the state has failed at its mission, and also how it has affected political parties in Mexico, and how you think it will swing the votes.
Well, I limit my opinions about politics in Mexico. There's an article in their constitution.
No, because you're not in Mexico, so
I can talk freely.
Yeah.
No, the best thing that can happen in Mexico in 2012 is to see that a party wins the election, whoever, and arrives to Los Pinos with a clear mandate, with a clear majority, with a clear mandate to implement these tough measures and to some degree drag the opposition towards a common agreement on the implementation of these very tough measures, some of them addressing money laundering, some of them addressing political corruption in general. If you don't have, international experience tells you that if you don't have a government who is able to implement these policies with a clear majority in Congress, with a clear mandate, you will not see any improvements in the implementation of these four types of measures that we talked about before. You will still be in this limbo that we're right now, with half-hearted measures being proposed and implementations being actually even more limited. So for those of us who are hoping the best for Mexico, we really wish that they come out with a clear majority. And this is something that I'm sure Carlos has a lot to say. Otherwise, the future could be bleak.
Well, happily, I don't agree with you here, because many countries have huge majorities in Chavez in Venezuela, and for a long time Kirchner in Argentina. And that majority can be a problem in itself, because the majority is just one condition. You need a very strong will within whomever wins to move in that direction. And in fact, because so many times the will is not there, we have too much power, you're the first one that is not interested in having institutions that will erode your power. My view is that you need coalitions with strong leaders, that precisely because no one has enough power, you reach the agreement that you need someone outside the political system, some sort of strong institutions that will limit all of you. And I, in that sense, think that no one winning as much power as you are describing might be better, assuming, which will try to answer your question, Isabel, that in the campaign the issue becomes so important, and the need of the candidates to position themselves very strongly vis-a-vis this problem is there. And I think it will be. If you look at polls right now, of course, it's always a very simple dichotomy, but if you ask people what is the most pressing problem in Mexico right now, security. In the year 2009, it was the economics situation. Of course, it's not that security is much worse now, it's that economy is much better. And so it's with respect to we are comparing. But what is true is that if you look at other polls, security is the most pressing issue in Mexico for most Mexicans, regardless of how you ask. And if you look at an article that was published under the firm of Enrique Peña Nieto in Financial Times, it's very clear that his position is more or less continue what has been done, but better, including things, the kind of things that Edgardo and Kevin have said, more social policy, etc. It's very difficult to imagine someone saying that they will negotiate with the narcos like Hernan did in Chiapas, and he's currently in jail. No one will really do that openly. There's some expectation, and some people do believe that the question is having this old mafia style of pact that existed prior to the democratization of Mexico, that it has to be said, stop working before the transition. The first guy that decided to modernize police forces, take out the kind of mafia-style politicians that had controlled our police forces, was Salinas, when he invited Carpizo and all these guys from the Instituto de Investigaciones Jurídicas in the mid-90s to try to reconstruct the attorney, the national attorney, the attorney office in Mexico City, all the institutions linked to the rebuilding of law and order in Mexico. They failed for a variety of reasons, but the problem was there before, because they gained so much power that you didn't have enough resources to control them. So I don't think that anyone will be claiming that that's the solution. I hope that precisely through the campaign, and that's something that this civil society should be doing, creating compromises with politicians during the campaign. If you win, even not the presidency, but a deputy position, will you be willing to support ABCD, law and laundering, etc., and try to create a pressure in that direction? Yeah.
May I respond 1 second to Carlos? Let me qualify the statement. It is true that the concentration of power and the arrival of a new government with a majority will not in itself generate the solution. When I mention this condition, I mention is a necessary condition, but not sufficient. The fact that you have a government with a clear mandate arriving sometimes through ballotage into power with a clear mandate helps. It helps to implement these measures as long as you have checks and balances in place. And certainly the institutional quality of the checks and balances in Mexico is far above what you see in Venezuela or Argentina. And in that respect, having a strong mandate, a government that arrives with a majority, with checks and balances, with judges who can challenge a president, with a Congress who will be having more incentives to follow the measures in order to finish with this money laundering story. But they will not just give a blank check to the president. That's very important. Because obviously with the cases of Argentina and Venezuela, even when you have strong majorities, I agree with you, you will not have the solutions being implemented.
Even worse, you try to solve
you try to solve it through discretionary measures. So I agree with you. So I want to qualify this. Yeah.
And I would like to throw a spanner in the engine, because that's all very well. But one of the things that we are seeing in Mexico is precisely that a significant part of the story has to happen at the state level. And, and what has happened over the past few years in Mexico is precisely that the breakdown of the old system has created a lot of fiefdoms all over Mexico, which are, politically speaking, outside the control of the federal government. Upon which the federal government has, and the president has, very limited control. So one of the crucial questions here, regardless of who wins in 2012, is how to secure the cooperation of the governors and even the local authorities, but that's a different story, but at least of the governors, to whatever the president tries to push through. I mean, so far, as I see it, one of the weaknesses of the current strategy is that collaboration from the government, from the governors, is tepid, to put it mildly, in most cases. And it's very difficult to wage this war and to pursue the strategy from the top down, simply.
First, I'd like to say thank you for coming over to the conference. And I just had a question about, in your opinion, like, in what has the drug war weakened? Has the drug war itself weakened the shift to democracy, to like a full transition to democracy, and maybe diverted resources away from institution building or civil society? So instead of the drug war being strengthened by a transition, has in any way has it been the opposite case?
You mean if organized crime is a direct threat to the electoral process in a democracy? Of course it is. By infiltrating political campaigns in the way they do all over the world, it is a direct threat to democracy in the way we understand it. It's a process of translating social preferences into political action. When you have that, the electoral campaigns are penetrated in the way they are in Mexico, the politicians who emerge from that campaign as winners will have an incentive to serve their real masters and not the people. So there is that direct.
And I would like to add something, something else, which is that not just in Mexico, but in Latin America as a whole, and even beyond Latin America, when violence levels go through the roof, there tends to be an erosion of support for democracy. And actually, when you take a close look at the figures that regional opinion polls have come up with recently, Latino Barometro or the Americas Barometer at Vanderbilt University, it is quite striking how feeble support for democracy appears to be in Mexico, I have to say. I mean, I was struck by the figures of Mexico, which are surprisingly low. I'm not claiming that this has necessarily to do with violence levels, but certainly violence levels of the sort that Mexico is experiencing at the moment don't help the cause of the consolidation of democracy.
Yeah. And there you have two angles to the same, trying to answer your question. Okay? I fully agree. I mean, the support for democracy throughout the region has been decreasing while the state shows to have a very weak capacity to protect life and property. I mean, that's normal.
I would add two things very quickly. If you look at the voting, the percentage of people that vote in last state elections, in those states where you have more violence, Chihuahua and Tamaulipas might be the extreme examples, the participation rate was very low.
Mm-hmm.
And in itself, that creates a very vicious circle because it's easier to influence an electoral process when there's a lot of abstention. Mm-hmm. And second thing I would want to argue very quickly is that even though the electoral laws at the local level are weak, at the federal level they are stronger. And I don't envisage in the presidential election that candidates will be willing to accept money from organized crime. Because the rules are stronger, but more importantly, because if your neighbors know you receive that money, and it's very likely they will know, you will end like the Colombian president that accepted money in his country. The incentives are there to be careful. And they have a lot of other sources of money, both the legal ones and the illegal ones through governors. So why risk yourself with that very menacing outcome in case you win and you have all this trail that you receive this money? So I will qualify this as
Hey, well, thank you very much for this very informative talk. I wanted to say that, okay, though organized crime is involved in many different arenas, it's clear that drugs are both the most profitable and the most conducive to violence. And something we haven't talked too much about, although we've broached, is the critical role that the U.S. plays in the international drug trade, both as the primary consumer of drugs and also one of the major, if not primary, purveyor of aid meant to combat drug trafficking globally. So I have two questions related to that. One is, what should we be doing internally in the United States? What should the legalization debate, if there needs to be one in the U.S., look like when we consider that heroin has been legalized or decriminalized and is prescribed in Switzerland? We need to expand the scope of legalization to encompass the drugs that are making the most money, which is not marijuana, and the ones that also have the greatest capacity to hurt people, not necessarily because of their physiological properties, because heroin, for example, is not physiologically destructive any more than marijuana if it is given in pure quantities and people control their dosage, which is what happens in Switzerland in their prescription program. And so it's also the public health perspective of harm reduction versus just concentrating on reducing consumption. And then beyond that is whether the external approaches to drug policy in the U.S. as far as what should be done differently and how we treat it as an international problem. So internally and externally, knowing that the U.S. is driving the drug trade in many ways internationally, whether Mexico manages to deal with this problem or not doesn't mean anything. In some ways it'll move to Guatemala as it's already moving. It may develop in Africa, wherever, anywhere there's still many weak states that are all over the world.
Thanks.
We have the numbers.
Look, it is true. Drugs is the main source of income at this point. If you look at the other types of crimes on a one-by-one basis, if you combine smuggling, human trafficking, and counterfeiting, you will see that those three types of crimes bring more money than drugs to the Sinaloa cartel, based on the cases that are open from the Sinaloa cartel. First, I wanted to give you this footnote so we take that into account. What the U.S. can do is to put much more emphasis on social prevention of drug consumption. The U.S. is doing very little, comparatively speaking. Most of you are students, so I would recommend you read, and for those of you who are not formally students here, also read the book published last year by a Canadian. His name is Irwin Weller. The book's title is More Security, Less Repression. And that book, also published in Mexico by the UNAM, it gives you a detailed, empirical, not just blah, 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 but with numbers, analysis of the experience of many European countries and Canada compared to the U.S. and how crime and addiction went down by applying those preventive policies within the labor market domain, health domain, educational domain, etc., and how the crime rates went down at a cost that was 90 to 95% lower than the criminal justice system approach. So the U.S. comes out extremely badly portrayed in that book. I would recommend you read that because that will answer your question without too much wording from my side and with numbers attached to it. The U.S., the current administration, starting with President Obama, has a clear understanding of this. President Obama used to be a social activist. He used to work within the Chicago. He understands these issues. He is surrounded by a team of people who do understand the force of prevention, social prevention. I'm not talking about situational prevention. I'm not talking about lights and cameras. I'm talking about social prevention, addressing the deep issues, attacking the social risk factors that explain why kids may wind up connected to gangs. Well, those are basic issues that should be addressed with much more force, with huge amounts of resources that right now the U.S. is not providing. If you attack that problem through social prevention without even addressing the issue of legalization, that is a very thorny issue in the U.S., as you know, you will find out that the effects within the U.S. and within Mexico will be quite positive.
Yeah, I would like to add Just one more thing. I mean, I totally agree with what Edgardo has just mentioned. This is not just about the policies. It's about the quality of the discussion to come up with those policies, whichever those policies might be. I mean, there's an issue of method here. And it seems to me that the first thing that should happen in the U.S. is that we should abolish the prohibition to think in the U.S. when it comes to, drug policy. Because there's a veritable prohibition to think, in Washington particularly, where I live. And I'll give you a very concrete example. Even someone who has an enlightened understanding of the problem, such as Mr. Kurlikowski, the current drug czar, I'm pretty sure that he knows. He understands. Even someone like him pointedly refused. I mean, he attended some time ago a global conference on drugs and organized crime and all this, and he pointedly refused to use the phrase harm reduction. Because he knows that the moment he uses the phrase harm reduction, he's going to have to run for cover. Because they're going to give him hell in Washington. Because harm reduction, for some people, is taken to be coda for legalization. So he also understands the very tight political constraints that he's operating under. So my sense is that before we decide on a set of enlightened policies, such as the ones described by Edgardo, we have a methodological issue, if you will, that we have to sort out. We have to abolish the prohibition to think and to have a rational discussion, i.e. a discussion not governed by the moral perversion of drugs. We have to have a rational discussion about what the options are when it comes to drug policy.
So we're going to have one more. This will be the last. Okay, so we'll have more.
Over here.
Forward.
So, on one side, you have mentioned we have these criminal corporations, right? And they need people. They have to pay as well, right? And that generates economic activity, right? And on the other side, we have reduction, I suppose, if I'm wrong, of foreign direct investments, right? Increase political deficit in the country. So I'm curious about if anyone has looked at the numbers which was for investment that has been lost in the country or economic activity generated by the criminal corporations.
Let's very quickly give you a number. The foreign investment last year was record high. So I don't know if it would have been greater without the drug and criminal problems. I have no idea. But it is much larger than what most people expect. I mean, it's slightly lower than Brazil. So the numbers are strange. I mean, if you talk with the directors of the most important firms in Mexico, foreign and Mexican, they continue to invest. It costs them more to do certain activities. But in terms of having seen a reduction of that type of corporations' investment strategy, there's no very strong evidence. What you see a lot is a reduction in small investment in those cities that are directly affected by the drug violence. Ciudad Juárez, the amount of businesses that have closed, but the maquiladoras continue more or less successful. So it's a very localized, but still very serious cost. Whether that is greater or less than the amount of money that is injected to the economy as a result of drug trafficking, I've seen the most diverse numbers. and some seem too high, some seem too low. So I have no idea on that. Edgardo?
No, there's no macro economic study that I've seen giving you a precise answer. My own experience in dealing with business people in Monterrey and other parts of Mexico tells me that the reaction of those large businesses that Carlos was mentioning before has not been negatively affected by all this environment. However, when you go down to the medium and small size businesses, then you do see a negative reaction, of course. Your capacity to fund a security system around you, if you have to live in places like Tamaulipas or Monterrey, is very limited when you're a small size business. So you don't have that capacity to fund all this security system, something that does not affect Volkswagen or other larger businesses. So you have to do a stratified study. You have to engage in a stratified study, much more on a microeconomic basis. Then the other type of people who come to see me just to ask me about risky sectors, for example, are pension funds, mutual fund companies who are allocating money to different areas of Mexico's economic sectors. And their main concern is where do we stand a higher risk of having our money mixed up with dirty money? So that's a question that I have been asked. So that's another problem. But there's no macro study that can give you a precise answer on that.
And I just very quickly just add something which is important following what Edgardo said. There's another problem which is not linked to the more visible crime or murder statistics. Let's put the example of Tamaulipas. You look at the murder rate in Tamaulipas, it's not so serious. But extortion is extremely serious. And it's been there for the past 10 years. As I can tell you a couple of things that have 5 years ago had to unwind their operations in Tamaulipas because they weren't willing to pay the extortion it was asked. Local small firms have not that option. They pay. And that creates a series of different problems. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to tackle your question from a different angle. There's no question that in Mexico, as in any other country in the region, there are a lot of people that gain, from the drug trade. And that means that there's a lot of people with a stake in the status quo. And that creates a very complicated sociology to this. Because I'm pretty sure that in certain communities in northern Mexico, when they see the army marching in, they don't throw flowers at them. Because what that means is the disruption of the local economy. And that creates a very intractable problem, which I've seen in my own country, in Costa Rica. I mean, there are certain communities on the Caribbean shore, on the Caribbean coast, that have been, for all practical purposes, overrun by drug traffickers. And where pretty much the whole of the community is involved in one way or another, either voluntarily or they're being forced to do so in the drug trade. Whenever the police comes around, the community itself actively boycotts whatever law enforcement efforts are being done by the government. So that tells you, how difficult this is, because in some cases, my sense is that unless violence levels go beyond a certain threshold that makes life unbearable for people, a lot of communities will not go along with law enforcement efforts because they have a stake in this economic ecosystem that thrives around the drug trade.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes left.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Ken Sharp from Swarthmore College. It's a terrific presentation you guys gave and the questions that you were asked all throughout too. There's an idea that's kind of hidden beneath the surface of a lot of your responses, and I want to test it out. I don't know if it's in, maybe I'm mishearing it or maybe I'm wrong about it, but it seems to be that in the short and medium term, the solution that the three of you actually think is possible is going to be something like what Edgardo referred to as a management system, where there's going to be a political management of organized crime as opposed to the political dismantling of organized crime. And the I know the Oaxaca story and that Ron is in jail, but Putin is considered to is a success. But Putin is a success not because he broke up organized crime, but because he is managing it.
Yeah.
And my suspicion is that in Colombia, that you've broken up the big cartels and you've learned how to manage the smaller drug exporting businesses that are run by the paramilitaries and to some extent by the FARC, and there's quite a bit of coca leaf being produced there, and it's getting shipped out quite fine. It's just you've been able to reduce the violence. So that the aim of the policy, although we talk about the aim of the policy as being lowering public health, lowering abuse and addiction in the United States, and we talk about lowering supply to raise the price in order for that to happen, that never happens. The price just continues to go down. That the real policy and the real solution that isn't publicly talked about is how can you return to lower levels of violence, and that solution is a management problem so that the state and the organized crime organizations reach some kind of entente. It doesn't have to be a formally negotiated solution, doesn't have to be building prisons in Colombia financed by drug lord money where they turn themselves in for a few years. It could be something much more subtle, like what I understand the current Colombian situation, which is the great success of Plan Colombia, isn't at all what it's publicly put forward to be, but it's a management system between organized crime and the state. Now, is that, if this is too politically sensitive for you all to talk about, don't, but I have to say, that's what I'm hearing underneath what you're saying as, in the next 10 to 20 years, the best that could be hoped for.
Well, I'm a UN official. I cannot sponsor negotiating with organized crime in any way because it's not just it's not recommended from an ethical standpoint, but it doesn't have a sustainable positive effect. What we have tried to convey here is that there are certain policies that need to be applied at the same time, implemented at the same time, in order to contain organized crime. Organized crime does not disappear from the face of this earth. It is too expensive to do so. From an economic standpoint, it's unrealistic. Organized crime is present all over the world. I started my statement in that way. Now, what the state can do, my main proposal here to you, is that we have to do everything possible to strengthen the state. The state, as a concept, is a great invention, is the best tool we got to make sure that we don't go back to the caves. I work in countries where what Hobbes described a long time ago is the normal way of life. I work in countries like that. And believe me, you don't want to work in countries such as the ones that I have to work in most of the time. And my main proposal is to tell you we have to find every way possible to strengthen the state. When the state is stronger than before in Mexico, you will see that the state will have the capacity to say no to organized crime, will have the capacity to restrict the scale and scope of organized crime. You will have no areas, like human trafficking, for example, that organized crime will know in advance that whoever gets involved in organized crime, the chances that they will be caught and punished will be very high. However, you will not be able to prevent organized crime from going into the trafficking of cigarettes, for example. This is something that no state in the world can do. I will give you an example of Sweden, where you have a huge amount of organized crime involvement in cigarette trafficking. So, what I'm saying that we need to strengthen the state in order for the state to manage organized crime. I never, ever convey to you a sense that the state should sit down and negotiate with organized crime. Managing organized crime is having a state with enough capacity, enough strength to establish the limits of where organized crime can operate and where it cannot operate. And of course, that means that you have to reduce political corruption. You have to reduce the capacity of the organized crime to infiltrate the state. In other words, you need to start the cleanup from within. We shouldn't be that concerned about capturing the Chapo Guzman. We should be more concerned about cleaning up the state from within, from its core. And by doing that, you will be able to contain organized crime as a result. I hope I'm answering your question, or at least clarifying this a little bit better.
Yes, at many different levels you are. Thank you.
It depends. I would follow with Edgardo, and I fully agree with this. It depends what you mean by managing. The U.S. manages its problems, but it manages from the state, putting limits on what can be done or cannot be done. If by managing you mean negotiating President Calderon with El Chapo, I don't think anyone in this table, or no one I know that is specialized in these topics, would agree that's the solution, because that was status quo ante, and it failed because it's unstable. So what is the aim of the current policy, no matter how limited and still unsuccessful is precisely to have enough strength to contain certain types of crime, which are currently almost costless. Which was the last time an agent of the FBI was murdered in Texas? I don't know. They don't do it. They know that that's the pact. It's not someone signed the pact. It's an implicit pact that certain things that are extremely costly. You shouldn't imply by that the FBI is in some sort of illegal pact with them. Everyone knows which are the limits. But at the same time, any FBI agent knows where drug is being sold in Philadelphia. They don't pretend to destroy that, because that would be impossible in terms of economics, organization, etc. So what you have is certain areas where the state always prevails. And we are very far from that, and that's what I think President Calderon is trying to do.
You both have a little bit of the kind of two extremes there, but when you look at Colombia, Plan Colombia is considered, from the point of view of the United States, to be a success. But in Colombia, there's been no lowering of the amount of drugs that are produced and shipped into the United States. So, and the purpose of the drug war is supposedly to stop the flow of drugs. So the mind does boggle a bit when Plan Colombia is considered to be a success, when the reason for going into Colombia was to stop the supply and production of drugs. So one has to ask, at least from the point of view of the United States, what makes it a success? And it's particularly when Plan Colombia is the model for many in the United States of what would be a success in Mexico.
Yeah.
So what's a success in Colombia is the fact that the state now manages it, but it hasn't done, you've broken the cartels, you've still got organized crime, it's at a lower level. That's a success. So my question, which is really for my country more than for yours, is what is the aim of U.S. policy? If it is a Plan Colombia, then all we're really talking about is something that would be quite wonderful for Mexico, actually, which would be to bring the level of organized crime down. But this now has nothing to do with drugs. Let's be clear about it.
One second. The objective of Plan Colombia was not to reduce the flow of drugs into the U.S. Of course, that would have been a wonderful result. Was to prevent the appearance of a failed state in Colombia. That was basically it. Now, the success of the Colombian experience goes far beyond Plan Colombia. Plan Colombia was a very small part of the Colombian success that is recognized by the average Colombian citizen. The average Colombian citizen could not leave Bogota City or Medellin without being kidnapped or extorted. And they have recognized that the frequencies of crimes have been reduced drastically in the past 6-7 years. The success of the Colombians has been having local governments and the central government engage in programs that are aimed at preventing organized crime and fighting organized crime with more effectiveness than before. is not the Plan Colombia. I would not classify the Colombian experience through the Plan Colombia. If you look at the size of the budget that the Colombians allocated to this prevention and law enforcement, and if you look at the Plan Colombia numbers, Plan Colombia is a very small proportion of the total budget devoted to prevention and law enforcement. Local governments of all political colors in Colombia, beyond Uribe, have participated in huge efforts to prevent organized crime, gang membership. So the Colombian experience is much more complex than Plan Colombia itself. And this is the last thing I'm going to say to make sure that we have time.
Yeah, I mean, Edgardo beat me to it. I mean, the fact of the matter is that, you know, I have a lot of problems with Plan Colombia, but I can certainly point one big success, which is the fact that Colombia, as a state, was in a dire state, in a dire situation 10 years ago, and is in much better shape today in terms of the ability of the state to project its authority. In terms of the ability of the state to exert effective control over the territory is an entirely different ballgame from what it was a decade ago. And that's a pretty important success, which is not only the Plan Colombia's making, but Plan Colombia played an important role in that. I would like to go back to the question of managing the problem. I mean, I agree with what has been said here. I mean, I wouldn't advocate that kind of, you know, either explicit or implicit understanding. I mean, but what I would say is that, you know, when it comes to organized crime and drug trafficking, you know, we have to accept something that is very basic, that a lot of people, and particularly in the U.S., have a big problem coming to terms with, which is that there are problems for which there's no definite solution. Corruption is one of them. Terrorism is another one. So to that extent, you have to manage the problem. You're not going to find a way to get rid of the problem. And that's one of the reasons why the war metaphor is so unfortunate. Because, you know, the war implies that somebody can achieve ultimate victory over this kind of problem. Well, that's a non-starter. And we might do well to accept that from the beginning. And that's also the reason why the moral approach to this kind of struggle is so wrong. Because, you know, for someone that takes a moral approach to decisions, it's very difficult to accept that to some extent we're going to have to coexist with a measure of wickedness. But I'm afraid that's part of our lot. And we might do well to come to terms to, you know, with that.
Okay, well, that concludes Convergencias 2011. I would like to thank you all. For coming. This was amazing, and it was very informative. And thank you again.
No, thank you.
Thank you very much. Congratulations. Muy bien, Carlos.